Access to Democracy is made possible by donations from the following organizations. Thomson Reuters, a global company with expertise and insight to unravel complex situations in the areas of law, tax, compliance, government, and media. Their worldwide network of journalists and editors keep customers up to speed on relevant global events. Thomson Reuters, The Answer Company. Crutchfield Dermatology, a full-service treatment center and Medi-Spa in Eagan. Their goal is to help you look good and feel great with beautiful skin. The Minnesota Twins are looking forward to another great season in 2023, led by the return of All-Stars Carlos Correa and Brian Buxton. With the return of numerous players who were injured in 2022 and some new acquisitions, another division crown and a return to the World Series are in their sights. Established in 2007, 45th Parallel Spirits was among the first 50 micro-distilleries in the United States. Based in New Richmond, Wisconsin, all aspects of production occur at our facility. If you're interested in visiting and learning more about the 45th Parallel Distillery, please check our website and plan a visit to tour our facility and taste our spirits. Truestone Financial, with locations in Minnesota and Wisconsin, has proudly served its members since 1939. Truestone engages, educates, and supports its members to ensure they have the tools to empower their financial well-being. Truestone Financial, your neighborhood credit union. Learn more at truestone.org.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Access to Democracy. I'm your host, Steve Francisco. It's my pleasure to welcome to the studio today a return visitor to Access to Democracy, the Minnesota Secretary of State, Steve Simon. Steve, welcome to our show.
Thank you very much for having me back.
Thank you for joining us today. So for our guests who may not be very familiar with you, other than the title that you hold, Secretary of State,
right.
Tell us a little bit about yourself. Where did you grow up and where did you go to school?
Yeah, well, I'm Minnesota born and raised. I still live where I grew up, which is Hopkins, Minnesota. And I went to Hopkins schools, graduating from Hopkins High School, and then went on to college out of the state, came back, of course, as so many Minnesotans do, went to law school at the University of Minnesota.
A great institution.
A great institution, yours as well, we know that, we're both alums. And practiced law both in the public sector at the Attorney General's office and in the private sector. And then I was in the legislature representing my hometown, Hopkins and St. Louis Park. And that was the job I had immediately before this job as Secretary of State. I am married. My wife Leah and I have 2 children, aged 10 and a half and 9, and probably too many pets. So
how many?
5.
That's a good number.
We have 3 cats and 2 dogs. We love them all, but it's a lot.
That's great.
Yep.
So let me ask you, you've been in public service for some time now.
Yeah.
What sparked your interest in a career in public service? Was there a mentor or a particular person or issue that drew you to a career in public service?
You know what it really was, honestly? It was sort of happenstance. My parents, growing up, they weren't particularly political, but they were interested in the news. So we had 2 news sources just lying around the house. This is pre-internet, right? So we had the Star Tribune newspaper. It was always on the breakfast table when I came down to get ready for school in various pieces. My dad would grab the sports section. My mom would grab the variety section, whatever, but it was lying there. And then the second one was Time magazine, the weekly news magazine, which came in the mail every week, and it was lying around. And nobody really pushed me, but I just sort of would leaf through them, or I'd see them lying on the counter, and I'd look at a headline. It could be a sports score, or an election, or a war, or a famine, or whatever. And I started to just take an interest in what was going on in the world or in the community. And over time, really by the time I was a teenager, if not before, I started to develop sort of a rooting interest, which is, okay, not just looking at some sheet of paper and what the headlines are, but what do I imagine them to be or want them to be tomorrow or next week or next month? And that, to me at least, led to a natural involvement in political campaigns or politics or government affairs or public affairs. And that's really what got the ball rolling. It wasn't anyone sitting me down. It wasn't a parent lecturing me about reading the newspaper.
To do this.
No, I just sort of happened upon it because it was around.
So you get elected to the Minnesota legislature representing Hopkins, and you serve 10 years. And Interestingly, during your time in the legislature, I see that you were chair of the House Elections Committee.
Yeah.
Seems to be pretty good basic training for the job that you currently hold, right? What did you learn during your time as a legislator and being chair of the Elections Committee?
Yeah, a lot. First of all 10 years I was in the legislature, I was always on the elections-related committees. Sometimes it went by different names, and in my final term, I got to chair that very committee. What I learned is Minnesota has something special. There are a lot of reasons for our success, but surely one of them, a big one, is the laws that we have passed, which are overwhelmingly bipartisan, in a bipartisan tradition in Minnesota, and we have a very pro-voting culture in Minnesota that goes back way before my time, way before my predecessor's time. There's something about Minnesota, and maybe we can talk about that later, that I think accounts for our success, and you really learn that early on, at least I did in the legislature.
So you were elected in 2014. You took office as Minnesota's 22nd Secretary of State.
Right.
And took office in January 2015. Your website states that one of your goals as Secretary of State says, quote, straightforward, expand access to voting, remove barriers to voting. Do you feel you've achieved those goals, or what's an unmet goal that you'd like to achieve in your current position?
Well, as President Kennedy once said, democracy is never a fully finished product. It's always evolving. We're always chasing after the next thing, and we're trying to remove the next barrier. So there's never a moment where you just spike the football and declare victory. And so I won't do that today. But I would say we've made great strides, both when I was in the legislature and as Secretary of State. Part of it has been legislation, and in particular this last legislative session was, no joke, one of the most consequential in 50 years, specifically in this space. So there's that, and that was the culmination of a lot of efforts by not just me, not just our office, but many others throughout Minnesota to get some of this stuff across the finish line. So part of it's legislative, but part of the things that I'm really proud, one of the things I'm really proud of that we've done in our office has nothing to do with legislation, nothing to do with any legal responsibility. No law told us we had to do it. And that is that we have more than doubled the number of non-English languages that we serve. So when I came in, it was 5, now it's 12. And to me, that's a bit personal because my mother was an immigrant. She was from Austria. And so I know, I lived it for 18 years under that roof. I know what it's like to have that kind of challenge and how important that can be in terms of people getting the information they need to make the choices.
So this information on voting and elections being published in these different languages that reflect the people who are citizens in Minnesota.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
And you know, once in a while people will ask something like this. They'll say, hey, why do we need any information, election information, in another language? After all, you can only vote if you're a citizen, and you can only become a citizen if you pass a certain English test, in most cases. So by definition, shouldn't anyone who's a citizen know English well enough not to need it? Perfectly honest question. And my answer is twofold. First is just what I know to be the real world. Having grown up in a bilingual household with an immigrant mother, I know that when it came to technical information, she wanted that stuff in her native language. She was a fluent English speaker. It has nothing to do with that. It's just that's how she was wired, and I think most of us are wired. And then the second thing, which surprises a lot of people, is in Minnesota, believe it or not, we have been doing some version of this, that is printing or providing elections-related material in other languages since 1896. In 1896, we were doing it in Swedish and Norwegian and German. Now, it won't surprise you or your viewers, we don't translate anything into those languages anymore. But it's the languages that reflect who we are now. So,
but it reflects the newer groups of immigrants that arrived in America in recent decades.
Exactly right.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
So in 2022, it turns out that Minnesota was one of only 4 states, as I understand it, that topped 60% turnout of eligible voters in that presidential election. Just for contrast, the average national turnout was only 47%. Why is it that Minnesota continuously ranks at the top or right near the top in turnout of eligible voters? What do you see as the factors that contribute to that?
I think there are basically 2 main things. One is laws and the other is culture. So laws, we have quite intentionally over the last several decades, way before my time in this lane and in this business, we have put down laws on the books which are very pro-voter. They're very pro-access. They're very conscious of balancing access with security, and we've gotten that blend right, I think, over the years. Things like same-day or election-day voter registration, which was passed in 1973, 50 years ago, that's kind of the jewel in the crown, I think. Things like the ability to vote from home. Any eligible voter, as we learned during COVID, that's really what saved the COVID 2020 election, is Minnesotans voting from home. Online voter registration, and so many of the new laws that we just passed just a couple of months ago in the legislative session, which will add to those laws and make us even better. So one is laws. The other thing I would say is culture. And I know that's a loaded word these days. I don't mean it to be. People talk about culture wars and that kind of thing.
Not that kind of culture.
Not that kind of culture. What I mean by culture...
Civic culture.
Yeah, I mean like a habit or a way of doing things. And our habit, our way of doing things in Minnesota is to vote, is to prize voting. It doesn't matter whether you're red, blue, or otherwise, or rural or suburban or urban. We get it in Minnesota that elections have downstream effects. They really matter. They matter a lot.
Yeah.
And there are all sorts of historical reasons for that, I believe. But it's those two things that have put us in a really, really good position. And here we are heading into a 2024 presidential election. And of course, as your viewers, I'm sure, know, presidential elections typically have a good bit higher turnout than non-presidential elections. And in the last one, in 2020, during COVID, despite COVID, we were #1 in America in voter turnout. Not only that, we set a personal best for 60 plus years. And we were just shy of 80% turnout. So we're aiming for something like that. Yeah, and I think we can get there. We have an engaged, interested, passionate population that gets it and understands that elections matter.
And I think something that's important to underscore too, this is on a bipartisan basis in Minnesota, isn't it?
Absolutely.
This is not just Democrats saying, hey, we need to vote, but this culture of voting. Interestingly, when you mentioned that, I thought back to my own childhood. I remember very well going with my mother and father when they went to vote at Minneapolis Central High School in the neighborhood where I grew up, and we go in the booth and they pull the curtain and they would vote. And I remember that very vividly, and them explaining to me even as a child how important that was, how important election day was.
Right. No, that's absolutely right. And I think that's a continuum throughout Minnesota. Families like yours and like mine and others, no matter where they are, no matter where they sit or stand politically. And when you look at the turnout of the recent years, despite the polarization going on, high turnout in red areas, high turnout in blue areas, high turnout in other kinds of areas. Minnesotans really, in 2020 particularly, pulled in the same direction, saying, hey, regardless of candidate, regardless of political preference, you got to get out there. You got to use your voice.
That says something, I think, really important about the health of Minnesota's democracy. But I want to talk to you about a larger issue too, Steve, which is very concerning. We are listening to rhetoric from politicians, from an 3-time indicted former president and many of his followers, who have attacked the validity of the 2022 presidential election and raised questions as to the legitimacy of that election. It has escalated to attacks on your counterparts in states like Georgia, Michigan, Arizona, other places. What are your thoughts when you see some of these types of attacks against your counterparts in other states? What do you think of this?
This is the #1 threat to our election system going into 2024. It's not a foreign adversary. It's not some sort of mechanical breakdown. It's this wave of disinformation, not just about the 2020 election. It is about that outcome and that result in that particular circumstance, but it's really an assault on the system. No system's perfect. I'm not going to pretend it is in Minnesota or anywhere else. But fundamentally, our election system, certainly in this state, and my observation in the rest of the country, is it's fundamentally fair, accurate, honest, and secure. 2020 was the most watched, the most scrutinized, the most litigated election, not even close, in American history.
And we should be very clear, too. Any candidate has the right to challenge the results of an election. They have the right to go to court. In fact, the former president did just that.
Right.
Over 60 times, as I understand, he went to court and pretty much lost every one of those actions. So when the courts have rendered their verdict and you still refuse to accept that, isn't that an assault on our democracy?
And that's the problem here. Everybody in America has a right to make a case, go to court, present your evidence. But when that has settled, when the courts, as you say, have made a final determination, and to get a little technical here, when in a presidential election, the electors in the Electoral College have already been named, they've already been, they've done their duty, they've already met and convened, and then you try, through peddling lies and disinformation, to upend that legal process. You already had your chance over here to make that case. You didn't, or you did and you failed. That's okay. But we've got rules in this country, and you can't hijack an election. And so I'm really concerned about that going forward, this sort of disinformation. And by the way, let me just say, disinformation is not the same as disagreement. There are reasonable, ethical, honest, patriotic Americans who have a different point of view
look at things differently
than I do.
Right.
And that's perfectly fine. And they're entitled to that point of view, and we should always have that debate.
You know,
I'm talking about disinformation,
Yes.
which is the knowing or intentional peddling of misinformation, of lies, of falsehoods for the purpose of undermining an election, or not just casting doubt, but really corroding well-earned confidence in the system.
Because you can't really say you believe in democracy if you only accept the elections where it turns out in your favor. You have to be willing. You know, I've worked in politics a long time, probably lost more elections on campaigns that I worked in than we won. But you accept the result when the voters have spoken. Otherwise, you can't really say you believe in democracy.
Yeah, I agree.
It seems. So let me ask you this question, because I've pondered this for some time and I don't have an answer. How do we get past this type of polarization? How do we get back to a point that you and I remember in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, up to the recent times, where people were able to be civil to each other? They could have different points of view, but at the end of the day, you accept the validity of free, fair, democratic elections. How do we get back to that?
Well, let me start by saying I am an optimist about democracy in America and democracy in Minnesota. I am an incurable long-term optimist, and I think it's founded in a lot of fact. Look, we are living in a polarizing time, particularly around these issues, but I think there are a few things going on and a few answers, I think. There's no one pat answer or silver bullet, but here's, at least from where I'm sitting, what I'm seeing. Number one is I think it's important to lead with the truth, to always try to lead with the truth. When we see this disinformation rearing its head, to confront it and rebut it. Now, there are risks there, I acknowledge that, but that's one thing that we have to do and that I've really tried to do and will continue to do. The second thing is to try to lead with some empathy. I make a distinction, and I think it's an important one for someone in my position or anyone to make, between the intentional peddlers of this disinformation and everyday folks, good people who are caught up in some of this or who are buying into some of this. Maybe they're not sure what to believe. Maybe they hear something from a trusted source. It may not be my trusted source or your trusted source, but to them it is. And they hear something and they take note and they think maybe it's more legitimate than it really is. So that's something. And then the third thing that people like me and others who touch election can do is to get the word out more and more about what the system is. We can have the debate and should all day long about what it ought to be. And like I said, reasonable people can say, hey, we should subtract this law and add this law and all the rest. Totally legitimate and reasonable. But let's get on the same page about what the system is. Let's not let that get out of control. And the good news in Minnesota, I can't speak knowledgeably about other states, but here at home in Minnesota, we've got great systems in place, checks and balances and avenues of accountability before, during, and after the election. And when people discover or rediscover what those are, I'm not naive, neither are reviewers. I'm not saying it'll be a light switch and someone will go from position A to position B overnight, but at least at the margins, they'll come to understand that maybe some of what they heard isn't right.
When I go vote, my wife and I go vote in my neighborhood here in Eagan, and when I walk into my polling place, every time I've been in there, I see a Democratic election judge, Republican judge.
Right.
So the idea that people are falsifying what's coming out of that polling place when it gets reported to your office is just not true. It's an unfair attack on those citizens who, by the way, volunteer, put themselves out there to serve their fellow citizens of Minnesota to make sure that we do have fair and accurate results.
That's right. Let me give you another quick example just by category. So one of the false narratives about 2020 was that elections equipment was somehow changing votes from candidate A to candidate B. So I can't speak to any other state, but in Minnesota, we have procedures for that. So within 2 weeks of every single election in Minnesota, in a public meeting that's noticed in advance, everyone, every city, every county that has a piece of election tabulating equipment has to march out equipment for public inspection and viewing. And they basically put these machines through the paces. They try to trick them by overvoting or put stray marks or whatever.
It's like an audit, a form of audit.
And then, using that word, audit, then after the process, we check the work. All 87 counties must. You can't not do it. It's mandatory. They've got to do a post-election audit, and then our office reviews that work. And so, to those who have suspicions or skepticism, that's okay, that's healthy. But I think over time, what all of us who touch the space can do is use trusted partners. It doesn't have to be me. It could be a sports figure or a large employer like Thomson Reuters, or it could be a faith leader. To just come to get people to understand or get reacquainted with all the systems we have in place in a state like Minnesota, all the appeal levels, all the citizen input, all the citizen access that we have to make sure that the system's on the up and up, that it's honest, that it's secure, that it's fair, that it's accurate.
Very important for people to understand that. And we should know, too, our own state of Minnesota, we've had recent experience about very close elections.
Yes.
We had the U.S. Senate contest between Al Franken and Norm Coleman that went to the Minnesota Supreme Court. The court looked at the evidence, rendered a decision that resulted in Al Franken taking the seat. And we should note that Senator Coleman, at that time the Republican, yielded after the court spoke. He didn't say the judges are against me, the court is stacked, this is all bogus, it's fake news. He didn't say any of that. He accepted the decision of the Minnesota Supreme Court, and Al Franken became the U.S. Senator.
That's right.
And isn't that how it's supposed to work?
It is. And again, I go back to this issue. People might have heard something from someone that they trust. It could be social media, it could be a national political figure, whatever. On our website, which is mnvotes.gov, mnvotes.gov, we have a sort of fact versus myth page. I wish I could say it's a static document. It's not. It's very much dynamic. We're always adding to it because there are more myths to rebut. But we have on there, I think, a really good, a comprehensive listing of, hey, you may have heard this, but here are what the facts are, with links and other appropriate information for folks. And again, it's not just about us and our office. Again, it's mnvotes.gov is the website, but we work with the partners I mentioned. We work with sports teams. We work with large employers. We work with trade groups. We work with faith communities and leaders throughout Minnesota, not just the metro area, all 87 counties. And I think, again, I'm an optimist. I'm an optimist about Minnesota and America. We've been through far worse. This is not the Civil War. This is not the Great Depression. This is not 2 world wars. I don't mean to minimize it. We are at a time of polarization, but we will get beyond this.
The challenges are very concerning, but I'm very happy to hear you say that as our chief elections official. I share your optimism, by the way. Let's turn the page to another subject. I think a lot of our viewers may not be aware. They think of you and they think, oh, he runs the elections in the state of Minnesota. But your office, the Office of the Secretary of State, also has a couple of other important responsibilities. Tell us about registration of businesses and nonprofits in Minnesota. We're down to about 4 minutes, and I have one more topic we need to hit. So tell us real quickly, what does your office do in that regard?
Right, real quick, we like to think of ourselves as the welcome mat for Minnesota businesses, because when you're starting a business, very often the first thing you'll do before you get office space or hire anyone or get a permit or a license is you got to make the entity come to life legally. It's got to be official and real, and you do that through our office. So we take in hundreds of thousands, 600,000 or 700,000 per year of filings.
Incorporation, right?
Exactly, and you've got to re-up every year as well, whether that's nonprofit or for-profit. So we do that and a lot of other related filings to a business entity. So we work with chambers of commerce and economic development authorities and academics and others to make that process run smoothly, make it easy to start and maintain a business in Minnesota.
And as the home to a lot of large corporations, but also a lot of small businesses. Actually, most of our businesses in Minnesota are smaller businesses. So they're going to have that experience of contacting your office to get started, perhaps.
That's right.
And certainly nonprofit organizations, which Minnesota is very fortunate to have tremendous nonprofits here. We're a national leader in that sector. And nonprofits, of course, work with your office, too, to get going.
That's right. Exactly right.
So let's talk for just a minute. We're down to last 3 minutes here. Your office administers a program called Safe at Home. Steve, what is Safe at Home?
This is such gratifying, life-saving work. Safe at Home is an address confidentiality program. It allows people with a well-founded fear of their safety, usually and typically victims of domestic violence, but not only, it can be others as well. It allows them protection. So the key service that we provide is they can keep their true home address, their true physical home address, a secret. completely confidential for all purposes.
Meaning, so it's not part of any public databases that are maintained by the state government?
Correct.
Okay.
So whether it's someone in the Safe at Home program enrolling a kid in public school, or dealing with a retailer or a department store or whoever, nobody knows where they truly live except the person in the program and us. And so that has enabled thousands and thousands of people since it started in 2007 to get that refuge, to get that break so that they can get their lives back together. And very often the participants have children, so there are children involved as well. It is life-saving work for people at the worst time in their life. And we have so many anecdotes and stories about people who literally attribute their lives to the existence of this program.
Are you aware whether any other states have something similar to this?
They do. A number of states do. We're now up to about 38, 40 states that have something. It may not have the sweep and the scope of ours in Minnesota. We're one of the very few states that have that blanket coverage, public and private sector. But I want folks to know, and they can go to our website again, mnvotes.gov, if you know someone who, God forbid, is in need of this kind of remedy, and it is an extreme remedy to have your home completely shielded from any knowledge of anyone, but it's an oasis. It's a way people can get help, and it's a way at the worst time in their lives very often they can have a guarantee, a blanket of safety, at least for some time.
Mm-hmm. Tremendously important, and I think our viewers have a better sense, thanks to your comments today, that your office does quite a bit more than just monitoring our elections and ensuring the safety of our democracy. Well, it certainly seems like we live in a time of tremendous challenges and threats to our democracy, and I totally agree with your observation. Those have to be confronted. But there's a lot of reason in a state like Minnesota for hope about the future and strength of our democracy too, and citizen participation in protecting our democracy.
Right, and I would say that one measurement of satisfaction or confidence in the system, there are many, but one really good one is turnout.
Yep.
And I don't think Minnesotans would turn out at nearly 80% in the last presidential election unless at their core, in their heart, they knew it was fundamentally honest and safe and secure. And that's a good thing. We should cherish that.
Steve Simon, Secretary of State, State of Minnesota, thank you for being our guest today on Access to Democracy.
Always my pleasure. Thanks.
Right to the